Pino, I'm assuming that social would always be a part of the advice you're giving in almost any conversation.
It would certainly change depending on the target group and the age and the ethnic group. So again, if you're going to target older Italians, you wouldn't touch it. But if you're going to talk to young Filipino kids, Chinese kids, you certainly would. And I do agree with what Steve is saying. The issue here is not restricting communications to a formal ad. And I think our challenge is to communicate as opposed to advertise. And so then if the format changes, and it is changing, what is the way we are going to approach it? And in the way we see it in other areas in terms of product placement in film as a way of communicating, we are going to be looking at what is the nature of the story, who's telling the story, how does that come through? So if it is a podcast, I could see podcasts on an issue of, say, female cervical screening being far more relevant than an ad if what it does is engages the issue from the community's perspective with the community's voice.
Ross, Great Media Group, what's your digital strategy?
Very interesting, very interesting. We,
if you do say so
we
yourself.
obviously, yes, we do have a website, we do have a Facebook page. We are certainly working very hard with the youth, especially, second and third generation. What we've found now with the new gas, which is the youth from universities, that every show they've got Twitter. It's all happening through social media, and we could see how the difference is between the generations as they're going on. They're finding other ways to communicate. But I do share the same thought. Is as far as advertising or getting a message across. How will that message reach the person you want to reach is the issue for me, because I see my son and my daughter on, gee, it takes them 2 seconds, they've seen something, they've moved on. I mean, how do we capture that mind, you know? That's a big issue too.
Yeah. And sorry to jump in, but on with the creative, I mean, that's the challenge for us. We get a brief and for the audiences that we're talking about particularly, anything that interrupts the flow is something that they want to avoid. They're getting very, very good at avoiding it in every medium. They fast forward, they swipe, they click. Radio is slightly harder to avoid physically, but we've all got this mental skip ad button when we hear the beginning of an ad, and we're hovering over it 5, 4, 3, and if it's still boring, we're thinking about dinner or work or whatever. So, for an advertiser, you have to find the point of relevance with the audience and come bearing gifts, whether it's in entertainment or whether it's in relevance, and giving some sort of context to your product and not going straight for a hard sell, thinking of buying a bike. No, I wasn't, and I don't want to listen to you now. So.
Now, to a point, I think it was Ross made in his presentation earlier on, and Steve, I'm going to come to you first on this one. Government advertising. Now, by the very nature of government advertising, it's often to solve some sort of problem. By talking to a community in its language, in a way, isn't that inherently telling the community they're part of the problem?
Yes and no. Look, I'm not up to date with what happens now, but what I do notice on non-English speaking background briefs from pure commercial clients in the last 5 or so years is they're usually very specific communities they want to talk to, and therefore we do engage specialists to work out the best communication strategy for those various groups and attack it that way. And I'm kind of just baggage on the strategy, because it's more the communication piece, and now where we're going to place that, and that's right at the time. Are we going to be in radio? Are we going to be in newspaper? Which is the best way to do it? Who are the players? Who are the best players? We'll book that, with a bit of help from discussing some of the people on the panel even. For pure commercial advertisers, it's much simpler than I think it is for government.
It's about building trust with that community, with being there, and finding. So with some of the work that we do online, when we work with government on our web forums and things like that, we try and build a consistency. So it's not you just come once and you do your thing and see you later, and have your digital screenshot photo opportunity. But it's actually about building a relationship on a few things, and then obviously when you drop something a bit controversial, a bit uncomfortable, communities are more receptive.
I'm going to come to Ralph with another question from Twitter. As online advertising moves into integration with content, in other words, product placement, native, whatever you want to call it, how can radio use similar methods successfully? I choose you partly because I know you have sometimes sneaked in content integration in the past.
Yes, with and sometimes without the radio station knowing, which is a different story. As far as making your message, being smarter with your message, there are ways of wrapping your message into content. Advertorials, we used to make an awful lot of advertorials, a lot more in the UK than we do here. But in 60 seconds, if you can come as an advertiser, talking about the category, and be useful to the listener. Here's something that you didn't know about our category, brought to you by Dunlop, for argument's sake, or whoever the sponsor is. Then as a listener, you're going, cheers, thanks for that. That was useful. I now know how to look after my tyres over winter, and that was brought to me by that, by that company. That's it's not going to be right for every campaign, but it's a smarter way of doing it. And there are ways, radio stations are one of the more flexible media forms because you can integrate a brand into a conversational medium. So it's not as clunky as it is when Tom Waterhouse comes on TV and starts reporting at the back of the sports report and gives his odds. On radio, you can integrate slightly more seamlessly, and I think that stations are having to become more flexible, and you have to be a little more creative with the media itself.
And Steve, do you see an opportunity for that in the multicultural marketing space?
Definitely. I mean, again, the bigger picture we're talking about is ways to communicate effectively. And the closer you can get to people's habits and hearts and minds, the more successful you're going to be. But you have to adapt to it. It's not one of my core competencies, but one of the things obviously I have to do, because I sit in front of audiences like you, clients, and you have to have a point of view, and you have to go, well, like clients 5 years ago, the big buzz, or it might have been 10 years ago, you'd probably all know this better than I, we've got to ambush them. I'm going, now wait a second here. We want to ambush them, we want to actually blow them up, we want to interrupt what they're naturally doing. That doesn't seem to make sense. How would a commercial message succeed in that environment? But it was the big buzz at the time, and I'm going, but the audience really isn't in that space. Oh, but that's why we should be there. And you go, but that doesn't make sense. We're going to advertise in a form that they don't want to hear, and we're going to advertise in a channel they're not really in. That doesn't make sense. Ever pragmatic as me, ever pragmatic.
Chris Roper has two very tough questions on Twitter. Question, what's with Tim's socks? So I've actually got to have a look down and see what. Yeah, fair enough, it's a legitimate observation. But also asks, how should media respond when given ads from government that aren't allied with the views of the community? Would you accept government advertising even if you felt it might outrage your audience?
Definitely I would, of course. Because if the government brings out a message, the government brings out a message to all Australians. There's no difference. No difference whatsoever. And if a few members of the community disagree or don't like it, well...
Got a good talk back on your hands.
I will have a huge talk back, and I can tell you they're fiery. Very fiery.
Let's go back to Twitter. We have Gentry with us. Dame Margot asks, why pay for advertising if people are setting their own viewing and listening habits? Steve, do you want to take that one first?
Well, it's like, I think the way to relate to this, at least the way I relate to this, was like my dad, who just thought when I said I was going into advertising and not finishing school, it was the worst day of his life. Not a legitimate job. I mean, why would you do that? And why wouldn't you finish education? I don't ever listen to ads. I don't ever look at ads. Ads never affect my buying. Rubbish. That's what he thought. But we know it's patent rubbish. No matter how strident you are about advertising, doesn't affect me. It does. Whether it polarises you in one direction or another, it feeds you information if it's crafted. You think about the information and it will change. It may change negatively, your buying behaviour, or may change positively, your buying behaviour. But it does affect you.
Well, I think we are out of time. So before I hand back to Mohammed to wrap up, please thank our wonderful panel.